Welcome, everybody. This is the fourth session of our year-long series, Policing in America. As always, we'd like to thank Dean Manning and the Harvard Law School staff who make this session and this series possible, and especially our faculty liaison, Jenna Cowie, who runs this series and keeps us all in conversation. This particular webinar in the series is about the economics of policing. And we frame it that way as a way of acknowledging that although we don't always think about it this way, policing and our criminal system more generally are some of our most influential economic institutions. It is through policing that we redistribute billions of dollars every year. We take money from people and we give it to institutions, sometimes cities, sometimes courts, sometimes the very same policing and carceral institutions that run the policing process. Of course, we also spend billions of tax dollars to maintain these policing and carceral institutions, which of course is a significant redistributive choice in its own right. Policing also redistributes wealth in another way by conferring criminal arrest records and convictions, which depresses people's ability to navigate the labor market, for example, and the economy more broadly. Indeed, incarceration itself is a wealth stripping mechanism. It can lead to the loss of health, to the loss of jobs, to the loss of housing. So in other words, sometimes policing works like taxes, imposing fines and fees used to fund the government itself. Sometimes policing can even work, ironically, as a kind of anti-welfare program, stripping the economically vulnerable of precisely the resources and benefits that the welfare state itself confers. We have an extraordinary panel of experts today who will help us explore these many facets of the economics of policing. We are so grateful that they took the time to be with us. None of them have any time. They are all extraordinarily busy. So we are very fortunate that they are donating their time to us today. Today, this is how the session will go. We will hear opening remarks from our panelists. We'll have some dialogue and conversation amongst them. And Professor Crespo and I, as the moderators, will pose some questions. If you have a question that you would like to share with the panelists, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. And I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Professor Crespo.
Thank you, Professor Natapoff, for those framing remarks. And it's my real privilege to introduce our panelists today. As Professor Natapoff said, it is an expert panel, and we're just so delighted to have them here to share their thoughts. First, I will introduce Sheriff Ed Gonzalez, who is the elected sheriff of Harris County, Texas, which includes the city of Houston. Sheriff Gonzalez served 18 years in the city sheriff's office, first as a civilian employee, then a sworn officer, leaving the department in 2009 to join the city council, where he served 3 terms before running for and being elected as sheriff in 2016. Soon after his election, Sheriff Gonzalez and other officials in Texas were sued by a civil rights group challenging the use of cash bail to send people to the jails that he oversees. And he made national headlines when he broke ranks with the other defendants in that case and effectively sided with the plaintiffs. Explaining that decision to the New York Times, he said, quote, "When most of the people in my jail are there because they can't afford to bond out, and when those people are disproportionately Black and Hispanic, that's not a rational system." The litigation, we should note, is ongoing. The leader of the civil rights group that brought that case had a, I guess you could, a kind of viral tweet in the past 2 weeks. This past week. He noted in that tweet the death of Preston Cheney, a 64-year-old man who died of COVID while held in the Houston jail for 3.5 months. Mr. Cheney was held because he could not afford the $100 it would take to get out while he was awaiting trial and accusations that he stole lawn equipment. Our condolences to Mr. Cheney and to his friends and family. We're also joined today by Professor Alexis Harris, who is the presidential term professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Washington. She is one of the country's leading scholars on the economic impact that the American penal system has on low-income individuals and communities. This issue for many people burst into national attention with the publication of the now famous DOJ Ferguson report. But I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that it's Professor Harris's scholarship, including her book, A Pound of Flesh, that has led the field in focusing careful, thoughtful, scholarly attention on this essential issue. We're also very fortunate to be joined by Professor Abby Atkinson, an assistant professor of law at UC Berkeley, and I should say an HLS alumna. It's wonderful to be able to welcome you back home to this panel. Professor Atkinson is an expert in the law of contracts and consumer protection, and her research, which you can find in many leading law journals, focuses on the law of debtors and creditors as it affects economically disenfranchised communities. For those who have tuned in through our website or who had seen the announcement for our panel, we had hoped to be joined by another alum of our school, Blake Strode, who is the executive director of Arch City Defenders in St. Louis, sort of ground zero for that Ferguson report. Arch City Defenders is a nonprofit civil rights law firm that provides holistic legal advocacy, fighting against the criminalization of poverty in St. Louis and its surrounding neighborhoods. Blake is a litigator, and he called us probably about 45 minutes ago to let us know that there's an emergency hearing in a case that he is litigating to challenge conditions in the jail in St. Louis in the COVID pandemic, fighting exactly the same types of issues that I referenced earlier that are affecting jails across the country as people who are held there, including people who are held there because they don't have the money to get out, are struggling with the worst aspects of the COVID pandemic. So for all of our students watching, you will see that this is the nature of life when doing this work. Blake is in court now on these very issues. For the three members of our panel who are here to frame our discussion, we were hoping to ask each of you, in what ways does it make sense to understand criminal law and policing as an economic institution? And what are the mechanisms, the ways through which money and wealth influence criminal processes and outcomes? And I think what we'll do is we'll start with Sheriff Gonzalez, and then Professor Harris, and then Professor Atkinson, and just invite each of you to reflect on those framing questions, and then we can have a conversation. So I'll turn it to you, Sheriff Gonzalez.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that warm introduction, and greetings to everybody that's tuning in and to these amazing panelists. I'm in awe of their work, and really appreciate giving attention to this very important matter. At a macro level, here in our country, we spend billions of dollars every year on mass incarceration. And for me, even as a law enforcement professional, to me, it's money that's not well spent. There's a bureaucracy behind the criminal justice system that leads to many inefficiencies and being ineffective as well. And I think it's important to understand the money behind it, because at the end of the day, there are political decisions that impact the system in many ways, from the way laws are created to the way they're enforced, and then to the way that we punish those that we deem to be not wanted in our society, if you will. And, you know, we, for example, here in our county, we spend over $60 million a year just on medical care inside the confines of our jail, medical care. And to me, I always challenge, even though it's in my own budget, to say, wouldn't this money be better spent in developing better health out in the community? And that's why we say that jail health is community health. But instead, we turn a blind eye that we're spending over $60 million just in one jail. And just to put it in context, I operate the largest jail system in the state of Texas. At this moment, there's approximately 9,000 individuals that are incarcerated in our jail. Over 30% are at least on one psychotropic medication. So the average cost for that client goes up significantly. And then there's some here with multiple psychotropic drugs. So it could easily go into the hundreds of dollars per day. Also, because we have such a broken criminal justice system that treats mental illness and drug addiction inside the confines of our jail, we end up instead dealing with individuals, for example, that have dementia, as I have individuals here under my care and custody, but also individuals that aren't deemed to be mentally fit to be able to go before a judge. They spend an average of 3 months here in our county jail, not really convicted or even charged to some extent, for 3 months before there's capacity at the state level to then take them for another 3 months and stabilize them. So sometimes on a misdemeanor charge, we may have somebody that's now spent 6 months incarcerated, no freedom, incarcerated. And you know, think about the tremendous cost associated with that. So we are dealing with mental illness I am the de facto largest mental health institution in the state of Texas, and that's an embarrassment. That should not be the case. We should be finding and funding community-based responses to some of these issues, looking at these issues not through criminalization, but through the lens of public health. Beyond the hard cost, and we know that these billions of dollars don't always include all the costs. There's also the cost, and you talked about the economics, behind the money with phone contracts so that individuals can contact loved ones. That's a huge industry. There's commissary funds, also another big industry. And then the funds that marginalized communities sometimes or others have to spend to support their loved ones while they're incarcerated in a jail system. And so those are also tremendous costs. And also, I think that we also missed the point of really looking at these costs even more broadly. I always say that my role as sheriff extends far beyond just the proverbial four walls of any of our jail system here. I'm thinking about the future as well. And we did a study here in our jurisdiction, and to me, this statistic is very profound. Every year in my jurisdiction here, 90,000 children have a parent that's incarcerated in my jail. 90,000 children. And we might turn a blind eye to that, but now those children, and I'm sure that the other panelists could probably speak to that with a lot more detail, they're likely now statistically to become justice involved. And so many times states look at the literacy rates at the third grade level to determine funding for future prison expenditures. And so to us, that's being very short-sighted. We gotta be paying attention early. We've done some early intervention here to provide some wraparound services so that we could support those children, because we know that the likelihood of them becoming justice involved goes very high. Also, in the era of this pandemic, we know it's a very difficult job market. We know that the economy has been disrupted tremendously. There's still no end in sight. This could still be a prolonged event for maybe multi-years. And so I'm really concerned about those individuals that are justice involved that have to re-enter that workforce. We see high literacy rates. We see high underemployment. And sometimes I know that the word we have to bring individuals and reintegrate them back into society when they exit. But I want to challenge that notion as well, because I challenge how many of them were integrated to begin with, because many were already feeling challenges. That's why in our jail population, we see a lot of people that come in with very poor health. And that's why I sounded the alarm early on in February or March of last year, saying that what was the obvious, that jail institutions, county jail systems, that it could really be a death sentence for people that are in custody, because we operate in tight quarters. We don't have the benefits of social distancing. We don't have the same standard protocols at the same level sometimes that we may find out in the community. And so we have individuals with poor health, high incidence of diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, all these other things. And so when you put all those things, it's a perfect storm. We basically have, when you look at our population, we have the equivalent of 3 large cruise ships, to make just a very poor example, but 3 cruise ships just docked full of individuals that are unable to get out. And why? Because for too long, we've operated a failed, broken, unconstitutional bail system that's dependent on cash. It's dependent on cash, and we've made decisions on who stays in jail and who exits based on their ability to pay money. And that's why I sided with the plaintiffs on the misdemeanor case that was resolved in favor of the plaintiffs, to say that we were keeping basically people in jail based on their ability to pay. And even now, today, we have over 1,000 individuals that are incarcerated in our county jail that have a bond that's $10,000 or less, meaning if they had at least $1,000, they'd be free today. But instead, they're away from their families. Our average length of stay is now 7 months. So our taxpayers are funding this bureaucracy. They're funding the inequities, the disparities that we see. And so those monies would be better spent, be more preventive. I'm told that in the state of California, it could cost almost $100,000 a year to incarcerate a juvenile in their system, we might as well send them to Harvard, you know, and help fund their education and provide more opportunities. But I'm very passionate about this. I look forward to discussion from these amazing panelists. I think we need to have a more serious discussion about these issues, because sometimes in policing, we obviously grapple with what we see with the naked eye. We pay attention to what happens through video footage and some of the abuses and the despair and the you know, some of the difficult situations that we've seen happen. But we have to peel the layers and look even further at ways that we could help stop the disparities and create a more effective and fair justice system that works for everyone, for defendants as well as those that may be victims of crime.
Thank you so much. Professor Harris.
Wow, I'm honored to be on this panel. Thank you for the invitation to speak. I'm blown away by Sheriff Gonzalez. Sir, I haven't seen you speak before, and I am definitely processing everything that you said. I think, you know, you really are an amazing example of how we need elected officials and people within our criminal legal system who think like you, who basically care about the humanity of all individuals. So thank you for what you just said. I think what I'll do is I'll step back. So, I mean, I think it's always so important for people who are on the ground level doing the work that we study as academics to be in conversation with us, like we're having as this morning, this afternoon, wherever you're at, because it really highlights what we're doing and that we need their expertise and insight. I want to just back us up and talk about the history. So if we think about in general, the criminal legal system in its historical evolution, it's always been associated with both social control, racism, and some form of revenue generation. So even at the inception of this country, from slavery, was a form of controlling people of African descent and allowing private entrepreneurs to generate profits from their labor. And even slave leasing, right? You could lease out bodies that you controlled to generate profits. And in 1865, with the 13th Amendment, it even clarified, right? Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, nor any place subject to their jurisdiction. So there's a carve out, which we're used to that terminology in all of our legislation lately, for people who've been duly convicted who can be forced to labor. And again, someone can generate profit. So there's always been this profit making connected to our systems of informal and formal social control. Even in the beginning of policing and the criminalization of Black people with Black codes and convict leasing, Black codes were used to duly convict Black people so that their labor could then be used to make profit for both the state and private entrepreneurs. So convict leasing was the same as slave leasing, where the state could lease out bodies to generate money. And it's sort of turned into, from 1970, 74-ish, right? Mass incarceration and conviction. And we've just seen this new evolution, new iteration of the ways in which bodies, particularly Black, Indigenous, and Latino bodies are used to generate money. Even now we've developed this new market around the criminal legal system, as Sheriff Gonzalez referenced. So it's bodies within prisons, right? And that's a whole industry. John Easton has a book on this, the Big House on the Prairie, I think it's called, about how local communities, right, then turn to prisons to generate local monies, employment opportunities. And so you can just see the evolution of the system. So I think that historical context is really important in this conversation about money and policing and our criminal legal system. And then we move on to monetary sanctions. And that's what I study. And those are the fines and the fees, the surcharges, the costs that people are sentenced to. But in addition, as Justice Gonzalez, or I'm sorry, Justice Sheriff, I've promoted you. Sheriff Gonzalez has outlined is that what we call cost points, right? So people face those sentences, the fines and the fees upon conviction, but they also throughout the system are paying both private and public entities. So you pay if you can for a private attorney. You pay if you can to be released before adjudication. But you also pay for, your court paperwork. You pay for detention release bonds. You pay for your phone calls. You pay for your money transfer fees. You part of the money that your parents send you or your grandparents send you while you're incarcerated is taken away and put into some account or paid to something or other. In Washington State, it can be up to 80% of what people submit. You pay for your JPay account that manages your money in your tablet. You pay for everything. You pay for, it's really interesting when Sheriff Gonzalez mentioned the medical care spent within jails, but people know that they pay for that. They're billed in jail and prison often for seeing the dentist or for a prescription. So you definitely pay a lot of money. So it's important in this conversation, I think, to always remember that historical context and the evolution. And in my perspective, the system of monetary sanctions is just a contemporary iteration of, while less sort of physically egregious, it's still controlling people. And it's not only extracting their wealth that they have in this moment, but their future wealth, right? If I owe $10,000 and I'm making less than minimum wage, that's money owed until the day I die with interest, right? So it's even your future labor that is owed to the state and possibly private entities. And then once you enter the system today, you're paying at every sort of cost point possible. Everyone has their hand out for you to pay them back. So I think I'll end there, but I'm really looking forward to engaging more with the other panelists.
Thank you so much. We'll turn it to Professor Atkinson.
Good morning again, or good afternoon, as it were. Again, to echo the previous panelists, it's just a complete honor for me to be able to share this space with Sheriff Gonzalez and certainly with Professor Harris. I should say, I mentioned briefly before we started that, for Sheriff Harris, my spouse is, a born, bred, and true South Texan. And so I had to tell him that I was going to be on a panel with you today. I was super excited. But in any case, so I think much of my comments will echo very much the comments of Sheriff Gonzalez and Professor Harris. I principally think about, I guess writ large, the economics of marginalization, or put another way, how economics determines marginalization, right? So one way, certainly we see that is in the criminal justice system, obviously, but insofar as both Sheriff Harris, Sheriff Gonzalez and Professor Harris have discussed sort of the private aspects of incarceration, the cottage industry of incarceration, it makes me wonder about the directionality, right? That one way to think about it is that, a market arises, an economic market arises around the criminal justice system. But, consistent with the historical account that Professor Harris shared with us, there is a significant argument to be made that it is the economic market that generates the system of punishment that we have. I was searching frantically as they were speaking for this quote that I recently came across from Eric Williams, who was writing about this in the 1930s and 1940s, and sort of making connections, he's a historian, making connections between racialization and the process of racing groups of people for the purpose of, capitalist and economic gains. And so he writes, quote, "The features of the man, his hair, color, and dentifrice, his subhuman characteristics so widely pleaded were only the later rationalizations to justify a simple economic fact that the colonies needed labor and resorted to Negro labor because it was cheapest and best." Right? This was not a theory, it was a practical conclusion deduced from the personal experience of the planter. He would have gone to the moon if necessary for labor. Africa was nearer than the moon, nearer to then more populous countries of India and China. So, that quote speaks to me in significant ways because we think about our current system of inequality and marginalization and race inequality and race and gendered marginalization as sort of a starting point, and think, you know, for me, think a lot about the economic condition that surrounds their state of marginalization. But I think it's important to begin to think how our economic system produces that marginalization and perhaps intentionally produces it. You know, so one way to understand these challenges that we face then in terms of modern administration of justice is through this economic lens, because in so many ways, the economic experience frames the criminal justice system, right? Poverty and general economic exclusion are themselves predictive of future involvement in the justice system, and they're also outcomes of the same system. So we know, of course, as previous panelists have mentioned, right, economically marginalized groups are more likely to be arrested, right, not necessarily more likely to commit crimes, as far as I understand, than during any period of subsequent incarceration. One's economic condition worsens, whether through, as Alexis has described for us in her important work, the imposition of burdensome legal financial obligations and or the inability to attend to existing financial obligations. So as a consequence, what I care about, debt accrues, again, both related to the conviction itself and to those financial obligations that the convicted cannot service while incarcerated. And this includes important financial obligations like child support, of course, but it also includes things like credit cards, right? The normal run-of-the-mill debts that need to be serviced, costs and obligations that need to be serviced. So the period of incarceration itself is permeated by a host of economic interactions, right? There are a range of private actors, again, the commissaries, the phone calls, the pharmaceutical companies, right? Who, as Sheriff Gonzalez, you know, as he gives his description, I can't help but think, you know, what are the economic incentives that are weighing against, pushing against any meaningful change to the system, right? If you have a captive audience of some 3,000, you know, souls in Harris County who can, whose taxpayers will basically pay for their medical treatment in ways that these individuals can't pay for it themselves out in the private space, right? We can see a channel of redistribution happening there, tax dollars going to some pharmaceutical company who is providing the psychotropic drugs. So there's subsistence economic activity, right? As Professor Natapoff describes, that taxes, it's just a regressive tax on the families of the incarcerated, right? We tax their ability to communicate with their loved ones. We tax their ability to provide for their loved ones. We tax their families, right? We want to punish the individual ostensibly for whatever you know, wrongdoing they have purportedly committed, but then we tax their families by charging them, by privatizing their subsistence and causing their families to pay those burdens. And lastly, I think I just want to share with you a recent paper that I got to, had the chance to read by my colleague, my Berkeley Law colleague, Abe Aneja, and his co-author, Carlos Avenancio Leon. And so they are economists, and they studied the access of credit for individuals recently released from prison. And they document the negative effects of incarceration on credit access. And they observe that formerly incarcerated people face drops in their credit scores, unsurprising, right? Reductions in access to decent auto loan financing, mortgage financing. And they further observe then that this decline in credit access then correlates with higher rates of recidivism. Right, so again, there's sort of economic aspects and outcomes, you know, it's sort of on the front end and on the back end, we can't escape it. It's the incentive, it's before. I think an important point that Sheriff Gonzalez made is this notion, we speak in terms of re-entry and reintegration into economic systems, but for many individuals, they had no entry to begin with, right? They had no integration to begin with in these systems. And that's part of the challenge here? And how can we expect to sort of provide for re-entry, meaningful re-entry for someone who never had any entry into these sort of broader economic systems and have to rely on participation in gray market or black market economic systems in order to survive? So absolutely, I think, my personal belief is that if we attend to sort of the economic backdrops, including the flow of the channels of redistribution, including sort of the starting points of the communities that we tend to see swallowed whole by the criminal justice system, that would do a lot of work in remediating sort of the headline problems, right? As Sheriff Gonzalez points out, we watch these cell phone videos of those sort of egregious worst case scenario bodily physical violence, but those are, it seems to me, sort of outliers as against sort of the daily quotidian economic harms that are imposed on communities, either by means of this criminal justice system or in service of broader economic systems that rely on our criminal justice system to sort of perpetuate them. So I will stop there.
Thank you all for these just really terrific remarks. It's been wonderful to hear you both sharing your thoughts and to see the extent to which you already, I can tell, want to speak with each other. And even though some of you are meeting each other on our Zoom for the first time, I'm hopeful that that's where we can go with the rest of the session and have some questions where you can all engage with each other. I think a common theme that I heard coming out of some of what you said is that each of you touched on, is that this goes beyond what Professor Natapoff said at the beginning about the ways in which the state is transferring wealth, but that there's tremendous amounts of private wealth generation that is going on here. I'm reminded in this of one of your colleagues, Professor Atkinson, Rebecca McLennan, who has, I think, a terrific book on this and on how the role of private wealth in the prison system stretches back so long. That raises, I think, a question for me about paths forward, because we're at the point, we're in this post-Citizens United world, right, where when people talk about politics, they talk about money. You guys are talking about the private money, but this is also politics, right? We have an elected official here who, as he says, is running the biggest mental health institution in his state. I would love to hear you think or talk about that aspect of this, right? That there are large industries that have substantial vested interests in the system as it exists. And if there's one thing that we know about our politics is that it is especially hard to change things when there is lots of money in the existing, in the order as it exists. So I think, Professor, I'm sorry, we've promoted you to justice, or maybe demoted you to professor, I'm sorry. Sheriff Gonzalez, as someone who actually has run for office to multiple different, to bodies, to the city council, to your current position, I'd love if you can share some, perhaps even firsthand accounts of this dynamic, of the fact that, you're out here speaking out against all of this, and then, there's lots of money in private prison, in the phone systems, in so many different aspects. Can you shed insights for that? And then if any of our other panelists or moderators want to jump in on this, please.
Yeah, I would say that, again, as a law enforcement executive, and especially running a jail, like, my job isn't to fund the bail bond companies and make sure that they continue to stay in business. I'm just about, trying to see what makes our community safer and what makes them better. And I think that there's extensive pretrial research that will show that simply incarcerating people isn't always the most effective answer. And I think that globally as a country, we've become too punitive, where we look at the outer layer of what's going on, and we want to punish that instead of really peeling the onion again and really seeing deep down. Because to me, it's like we're going to keep cycling people in and out of this of a jail system. We see a lot of generational poverty. We see a lot of people underemployed, and that really is a workforce issue as well, because once an individual has been incarcerated, there comes a stigma that comes with that. Even if their case eventually gets dismissed, 70% of our jail population, I have about 9,000 clients inside our facility as we speak. those 9,000 clients, about 70% of them are pretrial individuals. And everybody always just, their mouth drops when they think, wait a minute, I just envisioned that they were all guilty or something. No, this is a county jail system. Their case is simply navigating the system, and we're funding it every single day. And, you know, as an elected official, even though I guess one could argue I hold a very powerful position, you know, I represent more than 4 million people here in our county, that sometimes I feel very powerless when I walk through our jail, because it breaks my heart that I see individuals, and when I ask them, you know, if they visited with their court-appointed attorney and they not that they haven't, they've been in jail 6, 7, 8 months, and they haven't seen that they didn't have the money to pay a high-powered attorney. They're stuck in jail for months, and we're paying, and there's not, like, why is the sheriff worried about that issue? Like, who else is worried about it, you know? And then, like, I also see, and something that we never describe, is there's a lot of unresolved trauma that we see. I'll talk to some of the women in the programs that we offer, and I ask, how many of you have had an experience with addiction, with abuse, domestic violence? And undoubtedly, almost universally, almost every hand goes up. And some break down in tears when they give you their testimony. And so I understand that we're being short-sighted, because their stint in jail will end. They'll go back out. They probably won't be employed. And then now, you know, it's like they're going to cycle back again. And like, no one's trying to lift them up to make sure that they have meaningful employment, that they have marketable skills, that they give them a chance, that we X the box and don't require that necessarily for all jobs. You know, and so there's so many other barriers, you know, and they want to go back to school. Well, guess what? Now you may not be eligible for financial aid. You know, nobody wants to rent housing to you anymore. Few employers want to hire you. And so it's very frustrating to be an elected official. And in the criminal justice, there's so many industries that intersect. We talked about the public health system, mental health system, you know, so many, you know, that poverty, all these systems, you know, intersect with the criminal justice system. And we spend billions of dollars a year and millions of dollars to operate these ineffective bureaucracies. And look, I'm all for accountability. That's why I signed up to be a cop many years ago, was to help protect our community and save people. But I think that a law enforcement officer, especially here in the state of Texas, we can be tough on crime. We can be firm and hold people accountable, but it doesn't mean we lose our compassion and humanity along the way. We could also be part of the solution and make sure that we're helping reimagine what our criminal justice system could be, and rethink jails as well, so that we're better addressing those root cause issues that are you know, leading many people into incarceration. And that as elected officials, that we really inform our communities to say, there is a political dynamic to this. There is investment that's being poured into the criminal justice system, and it's much more costlier to do it inside the confines of a jail system than to fund these systems in the community space. And I talk to our military veterans that are in jail. We have almost 1,000 that are incarcerated in our jail, and I tell them, you know, and we talk, and many tell me that they first found out that they had PTSD while inside the jail system, because we have mental health professionals here. And I tell them, wouldn't it have been better for you to have that diagnosis out in the free world and be able to get that treatment? It would be much more cost effective. And specific to your question, you know, in my previous role as being mayor pro tem for the city of Houston, I use my experience as a law enforcement officer to know, again, that we can always incarcerate our way out of problems. And we saw a population, and we saw that in the city of Houston, the Houston Police Department, for which I served many years, that we were incarcerating about 15,000 people on average every year just for public intoxication. We were criminalizing that behavior, when in reality, they just had a drinking issue, but we were punishing them because they were out in public. And this isn't always the person you might imagine. These are college students that overconsume. These could be a business traveler, a business person, yes, homeless, you know, individuals and others. But we were spending millions of dollars for that population by choosing to criminalize that behavior. Well, I led the charge to open the Houston Recovery Center, and it's still in place and it's a model. It wasn't our idea. We borrowed the idea from other jurisdictions that were using it, but we were able to save millions of dollars, divert that individual into a public health space that we call it the old Andy Griffith model, because we would take somebody that was intoxicated in public. I'm not condoning drinking while driving. These were just individuals that were intoxicated. We let them sleep it off for a few hours. They get sober. We connect them to a recovery coach, and then we set them on their way. No criminal record, no stigma of arrest. We give them a second chance, and we kept, just meeting them where they were at. And that's why now we have to fund inside our jail medically assisted treatment, where we're providing incarcerated individuals with drug addictions a chance to find recovery. We partner them up with a recovery coach. And again, why are we spending those dollars inside the bureaucracy of a jail system? And why isn't anyone else talking about this? These typically are not topics that elected officials are challenged about. And I'm glad that it did make some into the narrative of the last presidential election, and even back to when, the previous election. It needs to be at the forefront because so much money is spent. We have to rethink the war on drugs, for example, about, and other systems as well that continue to be very punitive. And as long as we view things through the lens of punishment and not seeing how can we make sure that individuals successfully re-enter communities, then we're going to continue to see this. When people exit our state prison system, within 36 months, about 70% are going to reoffend again. And regardless of how you look at this through the lens of, a more right-wing perspective or more left-wing, at the end of the day, I want to make sure that our community is safe. So when somebody's exiting the prison system, that they don't reoffend, and it's you or your family member that ends up being victimized, because here's an individual that's already within that 36 months window. Nobody wants to hire them. No one wants to pay, rent to them. They're going to end up in the same dysfunction that sometimes led to their incarceration to begin with. And it's a revolving door that continues to be very expensive. And I also tell individuals that we're not rethinking jails during the era of pandemic. This is a much broader issue, because if individuals get sick within the our care and custody, we don't have the infrastructure. Even though I operate what appears to be a full-scale medical clinic, I don't have the infrastructure to provide more of that acute care. And so they end up going into our public health system, and those beds could be used for people that are in the free world, but because we're incarcerated people and we think just throw away the key, and they forget that these are pretrial individuals, then again, it just leads to more dysfunction. And so again, I still think we could hold people accountable. We do believe, or I believe, in the rule of law, and that, there's a reason that we need to maintain that. But let's make sure that we're addressing the disparities. Let's make sure that we're paying close attention to the dysfunction that can happen early on. We have approximately 20 women in our system right now that are pregnant. Who's talking about the growing number? Women are the fastest growing population in prisons across the country. We have 20 that are pregnant right now. They'll give birth at some point. If they're still incarcerated on a pretrial basis, not even guilty, they'll be separated from the child, and that trauma and impact begins early on, and no one's dealing with that trauma. As Americans, we never talk about dealing with people that have trauma due to violence, due to domestic violence, shootings, and all the things that we end up seeing. And so I'll pause there because I want to hear what these amazing panelists have to say. And thank you for the question.
To our two professors, I see you both unmuting. Do you want to either react to anything that the sheriff said, or to this sort of political economy question about there being lots of investment in keeping things the way there are? I'll let either of you jump in if you want to.
Abby, do you want to? Well, I'll just say yes. I mean, the one big piece of this is the loss of right to vote because you owe outstanding court debt, right? So we saw this clearly in Florida with Amendment 4 that several, I think it was close to 1 million people lost their right to vote. So there's a connection, direct connection with the inability to pay your fines and fees, and your right to vote, your right to drive, your right to have a healthy, free life. And I think it was around 2000, King County in Washington State there was a move for the King County Council. I think there were 12 or 13 members at that time to try and shut down a whole ward of the King County Jail. To really decrease the population. They recognize we can't just shrink the population, we need to shut down floors in our jail to really make an impact. Well, in response to that move, the King County Corrections Association, the jailers, right, and the police organized a petition to put on the ballot to decrease the size of the King County Council, targeting the council members who wanted to decrease the size of the jail. And they won, right? So they shrunk the council, and a number of council members lost their jobs because of that. So there is this real serious connection between politics, power, and money in the criminal legal system. But I think we can dismantle it, both from inside with people speaking out, but also with what a lot of what Sheriff Gonzalez just said is education and media. I don't think that the public knows the nuances and the extent of the inequalities that are purposefully brought by our policymakers with this state intervention, particularly in regards to fines and fees and costs to people. And I think if people know and learn, I guess I'm naive, but I just think that if good people know the truth of what's happening and hear the stories that Sheriff Gonzalez said, I mean, and two other things in Washington, because we've been talking about this a lot, there's a bill right now in Washington state to redefine who is a victim for restitution. And so if it's an insurance company that restitution is owed to, then a judge can waive that. So if you're owed mostly medical bills, costs related to the offense that you were convicted of, or to a car insurance company, that can be waived. Well, if it's passed, that can be waived. So there's ways to chip away and dismantle this. There's also recently we had legislation that, very incremental, but it now mandates that the Washington State DOC posts the contracts and costs for commissary on their website. And so people are aware of that. So we need more transparency. I had state policymakers calling me saying, hey, how do you know about these contracts? Where are the contracts? I'm like, y'all is state. You all are making these contracts yourself. I'm just a lowly professor. Like, I don't know. So we need to raise more awareness, I think, and conversation about this. And then Abby, please.
So I just want to chime in a bit, come back to the political economy question. And I think a lot of it engages with the politics, back to this idea of redistribution and where are the sites of redistribution that are most palatable to the masses versus, and for political actors, then what, again, hats off to Sheriff Gonzalez for, the strength in the position that he has taken, which I suspect is probably pretty unpopular in some constituencies, right? Nevertheless, so I'm sort of still, just reeling off the public health aspect that he described, and thinking about how, if we could make a political choice about where to treat endemic mental health problems, for example, would we do it on the front end in a community program? And is there political will to do that? Or do we do it in the context of, some site of incarceration? And it seems to me there's greater political will to do it in the jail rather than to do it outside. And that's a question of, that's a tax question, maybe in the political issues around redistribution in our tax system. Can we channel public money to mental health programs? Is that politically palatable? And it reminds me of, so I think about credit and debt laws and how bankruptcy filings, for example, are increasingly populated by people who are trying to get rid of their medical debt. Right. And so here's another site of redistribution here to deal with public health issues and problems that, is then perhaps borne by everyone else ultimately, but we'd rather do it on the back end, or there's greater political will to do it on the back end through a bankruptcy filing than there is on the front end to, for example, give people meaningful health care. So I think that as a political matter, I want to be optimistic like Professor Harris and think that if enough good people understood the broader stakes that, we as a populace of taxpayers would shift in our perspectives on proper modes of redistribution. But again, I think we have to contend with the powerful sort of economic forces that can make a lot of money by doing that redistribution through, for example, prisons, rather than outside.
Thank you so much. I want to follow up, well, with a comment and then a question that flow from my job here. So I teach criminal procedure and I teach criminal law. So I have a criminal procedure comment, and then I have a criminal law question for all the panelists, but especially Sheriff Gonzalez. You've raised this a few times, and also Professor Atkinson. I'm going to ask you about how we should understand culpability, how we should understand guilt, because both of you work, I want to say, on either side of that boundary. And I think that for the past hour, we have been blurring that boundary. We are understanding that what the criminal system says about guilt is not what is actually happening on the ground in our policing and carceral institutions. The comment I wanted to start with, and this is especially for our students, because the last panel, the last webinar that we're going to have in this series this year is really aimed at our students. It broaches the question of what can lawyers do? And it's understanding the role of being an attorney and being counsel. And I just want to point out here that we don't think of the criminal system as an economic institution particularly, and we certainly don't think of it as a welfare institution providing services, and healthcare and food. But there is one place where we do think of it that way, and that is in the provision of the right to counsel. It is essentially the one state paid for benefit that we claim to guarantee to defendants. And as Sheriff Gonzalez has pointed out, and I myself am a former public defender, and Professor Crespo is a former public defender, so I feel like it behooves us to notice that this piece of the puzzle is so profoundly important, because many of the dysfunctions that we're describing, that Sheriff Gonzalez is describing in his own jail, the criminal system purports to solve by giving people lawyers. And so when we don't, people who shouldn't be set bail are set bail. People who languish who shouldn't languish are languishing. And we do have essentially a welfare-based government benefit to which people are constitutionally entitled, and all too often we don't provide it at all. So I just wanted to note that being an attorney and those constitutional rights to counsel really are a big part of this machinery of deprivation. And so when we push back to enforce those constitutional rights, we're really talking about this entire constellation of problems. But so last semester I taught criminal procedure. This semester I'm teaching criminal law, and we are talking about culpability. We are talking about mens rea. We are talking about guilty people and how we punish and why we punish. And what we have heard all this hour is how we are incarcerating and punishing people who may be pre-trial. In other words, they're not guilty of anything. Or we are punishing them because they're poor, or we are punishing them because they are sick, or we are punishing them for reasons that have nothing to do with the reasons that we have a criminal system in the first place. And so I just wanted to invite Sheriff Gonzalez and then maybe Professor Atkinson, because you work on the civil side of this punitive aspect, to share with us how, going forward, how might we think about this, about guilt and culpability and crime in the criminal system against this backdrop that you have described? Sheriff Gonzalez, if I could invite you to start.
Thank you. For me, I think as sheriff, I have the unique perspective is that on one hand, for me, every day, my North Star is public safety. So we do have, the traditional law enforcement responses out in the community. And then on the other side, operating one of the largest jail, I see the outcomes of that incarceration. And so sometimes it is, challenging sometimes to separate the two. But one thing I've noticed, and I think you touched on it briefly, is that anecdotally, I find that many people forget that we have a system that's based on innocent until proven guilty. There's this belief that everybody that's in jail is somewhat guilty. and that they should not be released. And I remind them that we cannot legally punish people with jail. We can't say, especially, and we're talking largely about the pretrial phase of a criminal case, meaning that they have a right to, to counsel. I spoke about that briefly. For me, it's a pet peeve because too often I walk through our jail system and I do not see where court-appointed attorneys visit their clients on a regular basis. And so I've challenged our local system here about really looking into that and seeing, are we paying these court-appointed attorneys, and how do we hold them accountable, and how do we make sure that they're giving sufficient representation of their clients? Because sometimes I see individuals that even now as we speak, we have a jail population manager in place that does phenomenal work, Virginia Ryan. And when we find a client that's been kind of lost in the system a little bit, we'll find out, hey, why hasn't an attorney visited this person now? It's been a year and only once or twice. And so now there is a director that's been placed to manage assigned counsel here. We're moving to that model now. So that's a new dynamic. We do have a public defender's office that does good work. They don't represent everyone. And again, I think too often that we forget that we're talking about the pretrial phase of crime. And I think that we as Americans, is that even if we weren't seeing the lawsuits that we're seeing here in Harris County or abroad, I would still want to challenge the traditional system that we have that was largely based on one's ability to pay to determine who gets in and out. I think we need an intentional based system of incarceration that's based on truly looking at risk. Obviously, there's a lot of risk assessment tools. We have to make sure that we're careful with the built-in biases. We also need to provide a more robust pretrial intervention and pretrial services. We also have to do better at making sure that we're not over supervising as well, because sometimes that's another barrier. And we tend to just want to supervise everybody and think that that's the answer, and it's not. And so I think that we have to remember that we're trying to talk about the pretrial phase of a crime. And I think once evidence has been presented and the case has been disposed, then you know what, either send that person to the penal institution and let them be held accountable, or if not, release them. We're finding that many of the individuals that are in our jail, about 40% of the cases are dismissed, And looking at the survivor and the victim side of it is, what kind of justice are we really giving their survivors if cases are being, drawn out, witness recollection diminishes, other things happen, and at the end of the day, there really is injustice. And sometimes we assume that citizens want, jail punishment. They may want another type of relief, if you will. And sometimes we're assuming that we know what that victim wants. That's why these restorative courts and other processes are something for us to look at, but I think that, again, the biggest misconception is that individuals in a pretrial phase are all guilty, and that we forget that. Well, why do we want to get them out? And they have COVID, but why do we want them out? Well, actually, we're sometimes endangering them, because I have 2,000 jail team members that I'm concerned about, first of all, but they're bringing community spread every day into the system, because they're the ones that are out and are coming back into the system every day to support the bureaucracy. And so those are just a few comments about the culpability. It's like, look, ultimately, let them get to court. But something very disturbing, and many may not even know this about our current system here, is due to Hurricane Harvey that happened back in 2017, and due to the pandemic, and I'm curious to see what our panelists think about this, we have a backlog here of 45,000 felony cases that are pending, that even if we didn't file one other felony case, it would take 18 months at least to just deal with the backlog. And there's still jail churn every day. People are still coming into the system every day. And so it's ineffective, it's inefficient, it doesn't help anyone. People are staying in jail longer, pretrial phase. Remember what I said, pretrial, because people forget that, and they just want to punish them. They haven't even been convicted yet. So we need to make sure that we uphold the principles of innocent until proven guilty, because today we turn a blind eye, tomorrow it may be us or our family members that find themselves in the court of law or caught up in that criminal justice system. And believe me, we're gonna want it to be as fair and effective for them. And so we better be careful what we hope for, because we gotta make sure that we uphold those ideals of innocent until proven guilty. That's the end of my statement.
Thank you for that. I have to, just sort of reiterate again, it's so great to hear your perspective, Sheriff
Thank you.
Gonzalez, to really get an account of from someone who sees these things and not just, an abstract account of the world. So to return to the question of guilt, again, I'm such, I keep self-consciously describing myself as like an interloper here to think about concepts. I last thought about mens rea and actus reus, I don't know, and when I was in 1L, right? First year of law school. But I will say that in my, kind of concern and study of debt, right? That debt, even linguistically, debt and guilt are related. And the big picture might be, we might characterize both as living in the space of obligation. And what obligation does each of us have to one another? And I think in the criminal justice world, it's sort of about a moral obligation to comport and behave in certain ways that doesn't do harm to the community. And then on the private side, we might think about your obligation. I think about an obligation to a particular creditor. What is your obligation to Bank of America? But both are wrapped up, is that once you are, once you become obligated, we treat you as subservient to the creditor, whether the creditor be society at large, or in the criminal context, the individual who has been harmed. So we think about restitution there to the person, specific person that's been harmed. And so accepting, if we can accept that as right, then the notion of guilt is itself a social construct in all kinds of ways, right? Professor Harris describes, for example, the institution of Black codes post-slavery, whose very purpose was to really just reproduce this sort of social and economic arrangements by deeming things like vagrancy something that is, created an obligation in Black people to behave in certain ways. What stands out to me from the Ferguson report that I looked at a lot for the paper that's posted was that, the modern day version of that was there was a misdemeanor, right? Professor Natapoff, a misdemeanor of manner of walking, right? Goodness. And so if you walk, whatever that means, if you violate the manner of walking statute, we can say societally that you are guilty of you hold some obligation to the state. But those are choices that we make. And so in the broader system, then, if someone comes into the Harris County jail, and they are there for public intoxication or some other relatively innocuous violation, and they end up staying for months on end because they can't bond themselves out or something like that. I don't think that disturbs or needs to disturb this sort of broader concept of guilt. I think we have to worry about the set of behaviors and the sort of construction of those behaviors that we want to be policing in such a way that we can be comfortable, under the banner of process with someone being in pretrial detention for a long period of time, right? If we're worried about a mass shooting or a mass shooter, there's, versus someone who is publicly intoxicated or something else, I think we have choices there in terms of how we structure our criminal justice system that would make this concept of, guilt or lack thereof less significant going forward. But I think we have to look at the kinds of behaviors that that municipal systems, states, the federal system designate as violative of community norms, and how those are sort of concentrated in behaviors in certain marginalized communities. So.
Thank you. I just want to say I'm going to be thinking about your point about all the different ways that we legalize and stigmatize obligation for a while. That's such a great point. Professor Harris, do you want to add?
Well, just a couple of things. I mean, I think that, I love public defenders. I love attorneys, civil rights attorneys. But, we have to remember that the current criminal legal system doesn't allow justice. So while it's important that we have public defenders there when they can be there, that because of what Sheriff Gonzalez just said, 45,000 cases in backlog, like how can any sort of justice happen? How can any real relationship, understanding between an attorney and a client occur in that context? So it's not to say don't be a public defender, but it's to recognize the system that you're in, right? And the limits. And I also think that there are guilty people. There are people who have violated laws, both citations, traffic citations, all the way to serious felonies. And even if they're guilty and they violated the laws, they should be treated with the same humanity that people who aren't guilty, people who are pretrial or people who are found innocent should be. Everyone, I think, should be treated with a sense of humanity moving forward. So for me, it's more about a broader question of what does accountability mean and what does punishment mean? We've always sort of had this assumption in the criminal legal system that it has to be the same for everyone. And we don't allow recognition of the problems that got people to violate the law in the first place, the mental health problems, all the drug and alcohol addiction problems, even the poverty and the food insecurity and housing insecurity that led to the problem. So I think we need to really recognize that there can be differences. There can be people who do mass shootings and need to be removed from society in a humane way with treatment, but need to be removed and isolated in order to protect. But there are other people who need drug and alcohol treatment through a harm reduction approach and shouldn't have to make contact with our criminal legal system in order to get that health treatment. So I think I constantly want us to remind us we're stuck in the system that is not about justice, and it does not allow justice, right? We think of Khalif Browder in New York. But within that system, we still need to recognize that everyone, regardless if they're guilty or not, needs to be treated as a human. And we can do that. We can shrink the system in the name of public safety, save money, and create opportunities to have a healthy population that needs support.
And can I just tack on to that? So 100%, and just from a lawyer's perspective also, right? So not only is the system not conducive to just justice, right? We can expect, it's not fair to consider, public defenders as, counselors, as social workers in essence, right? Beyond just representing these 45,000 individual cases as they go through. If the statistic holds true, and as Sheriff Gonzalez tells us, we can expect 30% of those people to at least actively come in with diagnosed mental health challenges. What does that say if the only service they get is a public defender who is then responsible not only for representation from a legal perspective, but sort of thinking about immigration challenges, mental health problems, family issues? I just think, 100%, this is not a system that is currently geared toward justice.
And real quick about the 30+% that those are just the ones on psychotropic medications. It's really 60+% that have some kind of flag in terms of some type of mental health issue. They may not necessarily require medication yet, but they've been flagged by our mental health professionals as they have suicidal ideation or some other, they previously had a bout with depression. So it's really a high number that come in that already have some semblance of some type of mental health issues. So it really is a very large portion of our population. And I say that in the modern era of policing here in America, we're in the front lines of three important issues: mental illness, addiction, and poverty. And frankly, in my opinion, law enforcement should not be in the front lines of those three areas. Those should be more community-based responses, but instead law enforcement is put in the middle of that. And so that's something that I think is it's a big debate in our current society.
Right, and just to put this in national context, Harris County isn't any different. The three largest institutions that are psychiatric serving are Rikers Island, Cook County Jail, and LA County Jail, right? And that, I mean, that's a condemnation on the United States. And you know, I'll say personally, I have mental health, family members with mental health issues, and it's difficult, right, to maintain health. But God, it's so scary to think about if they get ensnared in the criminal legal system, what would happen to them. And, you know, there we go by the grace of God, right, really in our family. But this is a national issue. And I really like the way that Abby used talked about political will. Our political will isn't in caring for people in this country. And we need to recognize that and say it as many times as we can.
And this dates way back. It is a political decision, as you mentioned. Back in the 60s, early 60s, then President Kennedy had a vision to really dismantle the institutionalized mental health facilities, if you will, and really transition to a more of a community-based response. Unfortunately, with his untimely assassination and things went down, that vision never got realized. So instead, we've transitioned to a model that puts the onus on incarceration facilities to deal with mental illness and other things. With the homeless population, about 30% of our jail population identifies as being homeless individuals. Meaning, and I tell people, look, I'm sorry, but I'm not a homeless shelter. You know, I'm not a personal care home to deal with individuals that have dementia we have individuals on misdemeanors, historically, we've kind of changed that now, that would be arrested for trespassing. Well, to me, that's a red flag that they're simply loitering or, it's a public nuisance type issue. So law enforcement has very little tools. We have handcuffs, we have tasers, we have pistols, but unless that social network is in place and that funding isn't there, then we have no place to take them but into our jail systems. And we've even had prosecutors saying, well, at least they're not on the streets. Well, at least this or that. I'm sorry, but I'm not a homeless shelter. We should not be using jails for that. And so that's where politics and economics, that money is being spent, but it's being spent funding jail systems instead of putting those fundings into mental health facilities that could deal with people to maintain their stability. And when you do that, it does work. There's a program that I helped make sure was funding for the city of Houston. It's called the Chronic Consumer Stabilization Initiative. And what they do is they assign basically case managers and others to make sure that individuals that are have routine interactions with law enforcement and first responders, that we stabilize them. We find them a medical home. We make sure that they're on the medications and get to their doctor's appointments. We reduce those calls for service by 70%. So when you do have those interventions, it does reduce the interaction with law enforcement and the less need for jails. But we also have a 24-hour diversion center now at our facility. So when we identify some of those red flags that come in that our medical personnel sees that they've been involved in our mental health system before, we redirect them into a non-jail public health facility where we help stabilize them. They don't get incarcerated, and then we get them out back into the community. But not enough systems have that. And so again, that funding is being put, but it's being funneled into a criminal justice system instead of what the vision that then President Kennedy had.
I was just gonna say, several years ago, I was testifying before the Washington State Legislature. So on the flip side of what you're saying, so this was to policymakers. And I described seeing a man who had been homeless, picked up on a non-payment warrant for fines and fees in a park bench, brought in orange jumpsuit, shackled before the judge. And so I described seeing that person. He had spent 2 nights in jail to the legislator. And so the legislator says back to me, you mean to tell me that it's a bad thing that this man was given a warm place to sleep and meals? So there's this opposite sort of rhetoric that it's such a disconnect between the people who are making our policies and controlling our systems between, I'd like to think what many of us would think is sort of pure humanity for how people should be treated.
Yeah, and sometimes that humanity and compassion is lost. One of the things that was made public during the misdemeanor case, the O'Donnell lawsuit that was here in Harris County, is that some of those magistrates, they were videotaped their interactions with people that would come up that would be self-described as homeless, or they would say, "Do you understand what I'm asking you?" And the client would respond, "Yeah," and the magistrate would say, you should say, "Yes, sir." And then yelling at this individual, and the client, limited. Like I said, we have 60% illiteracy rates of our clients that come into some level of illiteracy, and the client once again responds, "Yeah," and he says, "That's it. I'm raising your bond for criminal trespass to $5,000." So that's punishment. That's no compassion. That's not humanity. Just because you don't like the interaction that this person that's before your bench, just onto an initial hearing, and all this is videotaped, and it was used as part of the way they were treated. It's like we're punishing people simply for being poor. Just a criminal trespass charge, nonviolent, and too many of those scenarios played out. It was different tapes of how those interactions were going. So where's the culpability in that? This person's not even guilty. You're just determining the right to bail and that it should be affordable. And instead you're increasing it to $5,000 on a criminal trespass.
But, so I want to just say, getting back to this question of guilt, right? They're not guilty for anything, that's on the books, but the scenario described is like they're guilty of not recognizing the sort of hierarchy of a courtroom, right? And
Yes.
saying, "Yes, sir," to a judge, right? And so in a sense, if we come back to the principle of obligation, it's like you have to recognize, you have to recognize that individual has to recognize their place, as it were, in the broader system. And when they don't, that causes a whole host of other problems. My sense is that often precipitates a lot of the, excessive force cases that we've seen. It's just the failure of the person being seized to sort of recognize the structure or hierarchy of a given situation. And so, absolutely agree 100%. What if and I'm going to be thinking about centering humanity, Professor is going, what would that mean if we centered humanity in that interaction? Or even legislated, like judges can't do that. They probably can't, right? Legally, there's probably some challenge that could be made, but then there's just the basic question of access to justice, or anyone to be, and the sheriff, right? I love that you are a sheriff that does think about these things, but institutionally, right? The sheriff shouldn't be pointing out that this is problematic.
I know.
Right?
Yeah, it's frustrating as well. I mean, just so many things that I see on a daily basis, and that's why I say I have such a unique perspective. And I think sheriffs, more of them should speak out, because my perspective does tend to be more on the minority side in terms of advocating for these effective, changes to our system. There were some judges during this pandemic that basically put out an edict that they didn't want to see any client before or in their courtroom that had ever tested positive for COVID, ever, even if they had recovered. And I'm like, so are they never going to go before your court? I mean, we have 9,000 individuals. We're working hard as we can to provide more virtual hearings, but man, where's the humanity to not even see somebody that maybe was previously COVID, but now isn't? And there's no solution. It's just let them stay in jail, and it's like, that's not right. And I think people need to remember their why they entered these professions. And I mean, we really need to have a reckoning in terms of just making sure that we have people that are in these positions. And that's why elections matter. And that's why we're learning more about the power of the prosecutor, the power of sheriffs, and we need to be held accountable as well. And look, at the end of the day, I know that this is largely centered on some of the the economics. But again, I think we don't have to have one or the other. We can have strong public safety. We can follow pretrial research, and it'll show us that the sky's not going to fall when we make significant changes to state statutes, to become a more intentional based system of corrections that based on risk and other factors, not based on money, not punishing poor people because they're unable to access a strong defense or anything like that. And so we can have strong public safety, but at the same time, we can have an effective and fair criminal justice system that works for everyone.
As we're getting kind of close towards the end of our session, I was hoping I could take advantage of having two professors here who are not first and foremost criminal law people to ask about what light you can shed for us from the civil side of all of this. Because one thing that this conversation for me has really brought out is this idea of the relationship between money and hierarchy and money and power, right? And we've been focusing on incarceration and the criminal system, but as you both know and as these comments have brought out, that's not the only way in which people, low-income people, marginalized people are in fact kept at their place in a hierarchy. You know, the conversation on lawyers made me really think about this, right? We've talked about the role of lawyers, and of course on the civil debt side of it, or on, you know, by the way, the side where sometimes we still use the coercive arm of the state. I'm thinking of my own clients who would get picked up on warrants, not because they were accused of crimes, but because they had outstanding childcare payments. And you know, the police would arrest them on these warrants. But on the civil side, we don't even have lawyers, right? You know, I was thinking that, you know, I agreed with both of you so much that we can't think of public defenders as the answer to this in the same way that we can't think of as jails as the answer to mental health. It's such a backwards way of thinking about it. But on the civil side, there aren't even those. I'm just curious if, having worked in those areas where debt is such a huge issue, whether it's educational debt, car debt, home debt, are there lessons learned for how we try to approach reform in the space where you all work, either things that have worked or that have been tried and failed and are cautionary tales for folks in the criminal space who, I think, to be candid, are coming to this maybe later, right, than other fields where debt and protecting people who don't have economic power has been so central. Things that you would offer as advice, basically, to folks dealing with debt in the world of the criminal justice system.
I'm gonna let Abby go.
Okay, I'll start. Yeah, I mean, first, you know, so there's a thin line between the civil and the criminal here, as you point out, Professor Crespo, because often the civil becomes the gateway to, you know, the criminal, or at least the carceral punishment for, you know, non-payment, for example, of a debt. And so, you know, to your question, are there reforms that on the civil side that might speak to thinking about problems on the criminal side? I mean, you know, I won't say, I don't know how effective these sorts of reforms are, but in a world, you know, that I think about of creditors and debtors, if we think that, you know, the convicted or the accused become the debtors, and that creditors then is this, you know, the state ultimately is the creditor, and the various arms of the state that become involved in the criminal justice system. I mean, in the civil side, we focus on trying to limit the behavior of creditors, right? To withdraw some of their power. For example, you know, in bankruptcy law, there's a limit on what creditors can seize, right? Their exemptions is that you can't seize, you know, state by state, but for example, in the state of Texas, right, you cannot seize someone's homestead in Texas, regardless of its value, because, you know, the ethos of Texas is home and land. And so that's how, in terms of, you know, structuring their exemptions for a bankruptcy filing, they have chosen to do. So, you know, I imagine that if, you know, the structure of the criminal justice system is not, you know, natural or organic, it's a construct. And so it seems to me, anyway, from the outside looking in. And so I think we can approach issues, in particular if we're concerned about the economic outcomes, by trying to regulate the creditor here, which is really the state. For example, thinking about how the state gets to contract out various aspects, like who gets the contract for the ankle bracelets and who gets the contract for the commissary, right? And thinking about ways, do we streamline that or make it a nonprofit organization wherein we don't have profit motivated entities stepping into the space, right? In California, we had incarcerated people fighting fires as like big news, right? And it's sort of like mind-blowing to think about that, like how grateful as a community, as a member of the community I was, that these individuals were going out and risking their very lives to sort of help us all. And so I think, but maybe we should say that, hey, look, you can't, it doesn't seem right to train people to go out and fight fires when they're in such a subordinated position. What meaningful choice do they have in that set of circumstances? Or maybe we should pay them like, maybe the state should be subject to labor law. So if you're going to use people to extract value, you have to pay, minimum wage, which is not much, or a living wage, right? In a bank account that is then goes to their family or something like that. So I think there are ways ways to approach the problem that mimic sort of the ways that we approach in the land of, credit and debt, limiting creditors' ability to just kind of destroy a debtor's livelihood in the name of, what we say they owe.
I'll just pick up on the thread. Well, one thing is I saw a lot of kids when I was doing my dissertation in juvenile court in California that they would be sent to fire camp, right? So the older kids would be eligible to go to fire camp and train to be firefighters, but yet when they were released from conviction, then they couldn't get a certificate to, so that's an issue. But I also want to just highlight the ways in which the criminal legal system is expanding to the civil side and allowing these third-party entities to be representatives of the state and have the same control of the state. There's a case before Washington State right now, Stephen Long, who was a man who was homeless, living in his truck. Police noticed the truck. He had been there for 3 months, but they noticed it. And you can't have a truck in the same, or a vehicle in the same space for more than 72 hours. They towed his truck. It was also where all his tools were. So it was his home and his source of employment. He didn't have his house essentially for 2 or 3 weeks, but he had this $500 charge that he had to pay the dang towing company, and the towing company was the representative of the state. And part of that, the case is regarding sort of the Tim's excessiveness, right? Anyway, so it's important to think about the ways in which the state is allowed to sort of sanction these third-party entities to make profit, but then also control populations as well, in the very same ways that police and clerks of the counties are controlling people. I know we're short on time, so I'll end there, but this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you.
It has. It kills me to have to end it. I wish we could keep you all forever. So before I turn it over to Professor Crespo to bring us out, I just want to say thank you so much. I want all of the students listening to see how many different ways there are and how many different institutional vantage points there are for engaging these questions inside the criminal system, from the civil side, as academics, as researchers, as public defenders. There's so many ways and so many spaces. So thank you so much to our panelists for sharing those with us.
My thanks as well. This has been really enriching and thoughtful, and I'm so grateful to all of you for sharing your perspectives. And to everyone watching, I just want to let you know that this is our fourth in our 6-part series for the year. We have 2 more installments left in the Policing in America lecture series. The next will be a bit of a departure from our format. It'll be on Thursday, March 11th at 3:30, and it will be a screening and panel discussion on a film that is based on Professor Natapoff's recent book, Punishment Without Crime. It's a documentary film that's been based on her book, and folks have been involved in the film, and Professor Natapoff, the author, will be doing an event on March the 11th. And then our last event will be in April. We'll confirm this on our website. I believe it'll be April the 9th. And that will be, as Professor Natapoff said, a closing question on what is the role of lawyers in all of this, and what can lawyers and those who are about to become lawyers do to address many of the issues we've been talking about all year. One last time, our thanks to our terrific panel. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Thanks, of course, to my partner in all of this, our wonderful co-moderator, Professor Natapoff. We will see you all soon.